but his screen magic, that you could depend on. And it made him one of the most popular stars of his day. His name was Steve McQueen.
Steve McQueen was the ultimate Hollywood rebel, the man everyone called the King of Cool. But behind the fast cars, blockbuster films, and rugged image was a troubled life full of secrets, pain, and family struggles that the world never saw. Now, decades later, his own children have opened up about the truth that changes everything we thought we knew about him. Join us as we uncover the story behind Steve McQueen's rise and the awful truth his children finally revealed. A troubled beginning. Steve McQueen's story did not start with fame, fortune, or the Hollywood spotlight. His early years were full of pain, separation, and a search for love that shaped him for the rest of his life. To understand the man the world later called the King of Cool, we first need to look at the struggles he faced as a little boy. Steve's father, William McQueen, worked as a stunt pilot for a traveling flying circus. His job was risky, daring, and full of movement, but his role as a father was almost non-existent. William met Steve's mother, Julia Ann Crawford, in the early 1930s, but only stayed with her for 6 months. When he left, Steve was just an infant. That short-lived relationship marked the beginning of Steve's lifelong sense of rejection. He grew up never really knowing his father, always carrying the weight of being left behind. This absence wasn't just about not having a parent around. For Steve, it was a constant reminder that he had been abandoned before he could even form memories. It left an invisible scar on him. Later in life, he would admit that as a child he wondered if he was good enough. That painful doubt stayed with him through his school years, his personal life, and even his Hollywood career. Steve's mother, Julia Ann, was young and unstable. She faced her own demons, most notably a long struggle with alcoholism. Caring for a child while battling addiction proved overwhelming. In 1933, when Steve was only 3 years old, she made the difficult decision to leave him in the care of her parents, Victor and Lillian Crawford. This was during the Great Depression, a time when almost every family in America was facing financial hardship. Jobs were scarce, food was limited, and survival took everything a family had. Julia's choice may have been heartbreaking, but it was likely the only way she believed Steve would have a chance at stability. By placing him with her parents, she hoped he would get the care she could not provide. Steve's new life unfolded in Slater, Missouri, where his grandparents lived on a farm. There, he also grew close to his great-uncle Claude, who played an important role in his upbringing. Claude was someone Steve deeply admired. He once described him as a man who was strong, fair, and kind. 3 qualities Steve desperately needed to see in an adult figure. Life on the farm was simple but steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos of his mother's world. Steve learned discipline, hard work, and respect from Claude. Even though his early years were filled with loss, the time spent in Slater gave him a foundation of values he would never forget. There were also small but powerful moments that shaped who Steve would become. On his 4th birthday, Claude gave him a red tricycle. That gift may have seemed ordinary at the time, but it sparked something inside the boy. It was the beginning of his lifelong passion for speed, racing, and machines. A passion that would later define his career both on and off the screen. Before Steve left the farm years later, Claude gave him another gift, a gold pocket watch with an inscription that read, "To Steve, who has been a son to me." It was more than just an object. It was proof of love, belonging, and recognition. For a boy who had felt unwanted by his parents, it meant everything. Steve's childhood may have begun with loss, but it was also where he first discovered strength, resilience, and the drive that would carry him forward. And as Steve grew older, the road ahead was about to get even rougher. From hope to violence. By the time Steve McQueen turned 8, his life had taken another dramatic turn. After several years of stability on his grandparents' farm in Missouri, his mother, Julia, decided to bring him back into her care. She had remarried and was living in Indianapolis. For Steve, this meant leaving behind the steady, caring presence of his great-uncle Claude and returning to a household that would prove far less safe and loving. When Steve arrived in Indianapolis, he reunited with his mother and met his new stepfather. At first, it might have looked like a chance for a normal family life, but that hope quickly disappeared. His stepfather was violent and controlling and often turned his anger on both Steve and his mother. What Steve had gained in being reunited with his mother, he lost in stability and peace. The quiet rhythm of the farm was gone, replaced by fear and tension inside the home. The abuse was not occasional. It became part of his daily life. Steve was no longer surrounded by people who treated him with kindness, but instead by a man who used physical violence to maintain authority. This was the environment he had to adjust to, at an age when most children need safety and encouragement. Outside of the home, things weren't much better. Steve had serious struggles in school that set him apart from his classmates. He was dyslexic, which made reading and writing difficult, and he also suffered from partial deafness due to an ear infection he had as a child. These two issues made learning a daily battle. In the 1930s and 1940s, little was understood about learning disabilities. Teachers often mistook dyslexia for laziness, and children with hearing problems were seen as disruptive or inattentive. Instead of support, Steve faced frustration and shame. He couldn't keep up with other students, and he often felt left out or overlooked. As the difficulties piled up, Steve's sense of worth began to shrink. He once admitted that he grew up believing he must not be good enough, saying, "My mother didn't love me and I didn't have a father. I thought, well, I must not be very good." These words show how deeply his early struggles affected him. At home, Steve's stepfather made things even worse. The beatings were brutal and frequent. On one occasion, Steve was thrown down a flight of stairs. Each attack chipped away at his sense of security, leaving him angry and desperate. But there came a point when Steve had had enough. During one violent encounter, he looked his stepfather in the eye and threatened him, saying, "You lay your stinking hands on me again and I swear I'll kill you." That bold statement showed the mix of fear and defiance inside the young boy. He had reached his breaking point. Instead of turning inward, Steve rebelled. He left home often, wandering the streets where he found acceptance among gangs. These groups gave him the sense of belonging that was missing at home, even though it led him into trouble. He started engaging in petty crimes, stealing hubcaps, causing mischief, and testing boundaries with the law. It was the beginning of a pattern that made his mother feel she could no longer control him. A crucible of discipline. By the time Steve McQueen was a teenager, his behavior at home and on the streets had spiraled out of control. His mother and stepfather, unable or unwilling to handle him any longer, decided he was incorrigible. That was the word they used when they went to court and arranged for him to be sent away. The decision placed Steve in the California Junior Boys Republic in Chino, a reform school for troubled boys. It was a move that would test him in ways he never expected, but would also help shape him into a stronger, more disciplined young man. The Boys' Republic was not a gentle environment. It was strict and often unforgiving, built to teach responsibility through tough rules and shared consequences. Life there meant living in bungalows with other boys, where teamwork was enforced whether the boys liked it or not. If one person failed, the entire group paid the price. For Steve, who had grown used to rebelling against authority and acting on his own, this was a major adjustment. He was now part of a system where his actions directly impacted his peers, and they made sure he understood that. At first, Steve didn't blend in easily. He got into fights, tested boundaries, and clashed with the rules of the school. Other boys quickly reminded him that there were consequences for disrupting the group. "I got my lumps," Steve later admitted. Those lumps came from the boys themselves, who enforced discipline in their own way to make sure everyone did their part. By the time Steve left the Boys' Republic at the age of 16, he was not the same boy who had arrived. The discipline, structure, and peer accountability had forced him to grow. He had learned responsibility and how to function as part of a community. Years later, he summed it up simply, "I paid my dues with the other fellows." For a boy who had felt abandoned, unloved, and angry, this was an important shift. The reform school gave him a foundation he had been missing all his life. It didn't erase the pain of his past, but it gave him tools to face the future. But even with this new sense of discipline, Steve's journey was far from stable, and the restless years ahead would take him into even rougher places. Circus, crime, and chain gangs. Even after leaving the Boys' Republic with new discipline and maturity, Steve McQueen's restlessness didn't disappear. By the time he was 14, he felt the need to break away from the farm life once again. This time, he didn't say goodbye. He simply left, chasing freedom wherever it would take him. At 14, Steve joined the circus for a short time. For him, it was a chance to escape routine and search for something that gave him a sense of belonging. The circus gave him adventure, but it was far from stable. He soon drifted back into his old habits, finding his way once again to Los Angeles. Back in the city, Steve returned to the only world he knew outside of family, the gangs. These groups welcomed him, but they also pulled him deeper into crime. Petty theft, mischief, and stealing car parts became part of his daily life. He wasn't just rebelling against authority anymore, he was shaping a pattern of behavior that could easily have landed him behind bars permanently if it continued. It wasn't long before Steve's actions caught up with him. He was arrested for theft, a turning point that could have led him toward serious legal trouble. But instead of being handed over fully to the system, he was returned to his stepfather. This proved to be just as dangerous. The stepfather, already known for his violent temper, unleashed severe physical punishment on Steve. At one point, he beat him so badly and even threw him down a flight of stairs. That kind of violence might have broken some boys, but for Steve it sparked something different: defiance. Looking his stepfather in the eye, he made a threat that showed just how much anger he carried inside. "You lay your stinking hands on me again, and I swear I'll kill you." It was a chilling moment that marked his determination never to be a victim again. Even with his spirit of rebellion, Steve's drifting lifestyle was dangerous and unpredictable. His inability to stay grounded led him into one of the darkest chapters of his youth. While moving through the Deep South, he was arrested again, this time for vagrancy. He had no steady job, no money, and nowhere to go, and the law treated that as a crime. The punishment was severe. Steve was sentenced to 30 days on a chain gang. For a teenager, this was an almost unthinkable experience. Chain gangs were brutal, forcing men to do hard labor under harsh conditions, often in the heat and with little compassion from guards. For Steve, it was another lesson in how unforgiving the world could be. It showed him the raw, punishing side of America's justice system and left a mark that he would never forget. This period of drifting, crime, and punishment represented the lowest point in Steve McQueen's early life. But even here, his story wasn't finished. Because soon, he would find himself on a path toward the military, and that's where everything began to change. Enlistment at age 17. By the time Steve McQueen turned 17, he had lived through more instability than most people face in a lifetime. He had been abandoned, abused, and jailed, and had drifted from one uncertain place to another. But in 1947, he took a step that would add discipline and structure to his life. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. Because he was not yet 18, he needed his mother's consent to join. Despite their rocky history, Julia agreed, and Steve began a chapter that would prove both challenging and transformative. Steve's journey as a Marine began at Parris Island in South Carolina, where he endured boot camp. Boot camp was tough on every recruit, but for Steve, who had always resisted authority, it was especially hard. The physical training was grueling, and the rigid order of military life clashed with his rebellious spirit. For someone who had grown up pushing back against rules, being forced to follow them without question was a struggle. As expected, Steve didn't adjust easily. He clashed with authority and broke rules more than once. Over time, he was demoted 7 separate times, a clear sign of how often he tested the patience of his superiors. One of the most serious incidents happened when Steve went AWOL. After receiving a weekend pass, he decided not to return when it expired. Instead, he spent 2 weeks with his girlfriend, Barbara Ross. The Marines didn't take this lightly. When the shore patrol finally caught up with him, Steve resisted arrest, making his situation even worse. For this offense, he was sentenced to 41 days in the brig, a military prison. For a young man who had already seen the inside of reform school and even a chain gang, prison was nothing new. But this time it carried a deeper message. Steve was learning that the Marines had rules that could not be ignored. The punishment was strict, and it forced him to consider the path he was on. Steve's turning point came not from punishment, but from an act of bravery. During an Arctic exercise, a tank carrying several Marines nearly broke through the ice. The situation was life-threatening, but Steve acted quickly. He risked his own life to save 5 of his fellow Marines, pulling them from the sinking tank just in time. This moment earned him recognition and respect from both his peers and his superiors. It showed that beneath the rebellious surface, Steve had courage, leadership, and the ability to step up when it mattered most. He was honorably discharged in 1950, just a few years after joining. Looking back on his time in uniform, Steve often credited the Marines with changing his life. "The Marines made a man out of me," he said. "I learned how to get along with others, and I had a platform to jump off of." The military had given Steve McQueen the structure he had never known before. But once he left, the next stage of his life would throw him back into the unpredictable world of love, fame, and Hollywood. Women, love, and family strains. Steve McQueen's love life was as intense as his screen roles. It brought joy, confusion, and pain to everyone involved, including himself. His need for freedom often clashed with the need for trust at home, and that tension shows up again and again in his relationships. Steve married actress and dancer Neely Adams on November 2, 1956. They built a family quickly. Their daughter, Terry Leslie, was born on June 5, 1959, and their son, Chad, arrived on December 28, 1960. For a while, they looked like a strong Hollywood couple, raising 2 children while Steve's career rose fast. Behind the scenes, things were difficult. In her memoir, Neela later described a marriage marked by infidelity, jealous fights, and physical and emotional abuse. She also revealed that in 1971, when the relationship was already breaking down, she had an abortion. These details show a private world that was often unstable and painful. The couple divorced in 1972. Terry would later pass away in 1998, a loss that still hurts when people close to the family talk about it. Chad, who inherited his father's love of racing and the industry, has been open about both the good and the bad in his father's legacy. During and after his marriage to Neela, Steve was linked to several well-known women. He was connected romantically to actress Gia Scala. Mamie Van Doren also said they had a relationship around 1959, and she claimed they experimented with hallucinogens together. Model and actress Lauren Hutton later said she too had an affair with him. Each of these relationships added to his image as a magnetic leading man off-screen, but they also deepened the rifts at home. One of the most serious episodes involved actress Barbara Lee, with whom Steve had a relationship in the early 1970s. She became pregnant, and she later had an abortion. These events underline a pattern. Steve's restless and rebellious spirit did not stop at work or racing. It shaped his romantic life as well. Intensity, attraction, and risk were always close by, and stability was hard to hold. Steve met Ally McGraw while filming The Getaway, and they married in 1973 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Their relationship drew big headlines. On screen and off, they had strong chemistry. Friends and observers often say that Ally may have been the great love of his life. Still, their marriage had real hardships. Ali suffered a miscarriage, which was a devastating loss for them both. Fame and the demands of Steve's lifestyle added pressure they could not escape, and the marriage eventually ended. Steve married model Barbara Minty on January 16, 1980, less than a year before he died. She stood by him during his fight with cancer and helped him find peace in his final months. With Barbara, Steve embraced evangelical Christianity, guided in part by his flight instructor Sammy Mason, Mason's son Pete, and a visit from Billy Graham. Barbara later wrote about this time, describing a man who searched for forgiveness, comfort, and a new kind of strength near the end. Love brought Steve bright moments but also left scars, and the hardest truths were still to come from his children's side of the story. Fatherhood and the next generation. Steve McQueen may have been celebrated as the king of cool on screen, but at home being a father was complicated. His demanding career, reckless personal choices, and inner demons made family life difficult, and his children grew up seeing both sides of the man behind the Hollywood image. Steve's first marriage to Neela Adams gave him 2 children, Terry Leslie and Chad. While he loved them in his own way, his Hollywood lifestyle often kept him away. He worked long hours, spent time on sets, and lived a life filled with racing, parties, and affairs. This left little room for steady parenting. Chad McQueen followed in his father's footsteps in several ways. He became an actor for a time and, more importantly, carried on Steve's love of racing, building a career around motorsports. Over the years, Chad has spoken openly about his father's flaws. He described him as a man with charisma and drive, but also as someone who struggled to control his anger and impulses. For Chad, being Steve McQueen's son meant inheriting a legacy of fame while also confronting painful truths. Terry Leslie's life was even more troubled. She lived in her father's shadow and reportedly struggled with her own battles as an adult. Her death in 1998 at the age of 38 was a tragic loss for the McQueen family. It highlighted how the difficulties within the family stretched far beyond Steve himself. Over the years, both Chad and Terry shared stories that revealed another side of Steve McQueen. They spoke about his infidelity, his temper, and the unstable atmosphere at home. These accounts painted a different picture from the cool, confident figure the world adored on screen. They showed a man who was deeply flawed, often volatile, and unable to fully provide the stability his children needed. Steve's children and grandchildren gave the world a clearer picture of him, but his own life story took another dramatic turn when illness struck and forced him to face his mortality. Illness, asbestos, and desperation. By the late 1970s, Steve McQueen seemed unstoppable to the outside world. He was still working, still racing, and still carrying the image of Hollywood's cool rebel. But behind the scenes, his health was starting to collapse in a way no fame or money could shield him from. In 1978, Steve began to suffer from a chronic cough. At first, he thought it was just the result of years of smoking, so he gave up cigarettes. But quitting didn't help. Soon, he developed shortness of breath, which worsened over time. Doctors prescribed antibiotics, thinking it was an infection, but nothing seemed to improve his condition. In December 1979, after finishing the film The Hunter, Steve finally received a proper diagnosis. Tests revealed he had pleural mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer affecting the lining of the lungs. At the time, there was no cure. The disease was strongly linked to asbestos exposure, and doctors told him it was terminal. For a man who had survived a chaotic childhood, crime, and the Marines, the news was devastating. Once the diagnosis was made, the question became, where had Steve been exposed to asbestos? He believed the answer lay in his time in the Marines. During his service, he had been involved in removing asbestos insulation from pipes aboard a troop ship. The work was dusty, unprotected, and dangerous, and Steve later said this was the most likely cause of his illness. Conventional doctors in the United States told Steve there was little they could do beyond easing his symptoms. Not willing to accept this, he looked for other options. In July 1980, he traveled to Rosarito Beach, Mexico for alternative treatments under William Donald Kelly, a controversial figure who promoted a variation of the Gerson therapy. The treatments were unusual and unproven. They included coffee enemas, frequent shampoo washes, daily injections of fluids made from cattle and sheep cells, massages, and laetrile, a substance some believed to fight cancer but which was widely considered toxic and ineffective. Steve reportedly paid up to $40,000 a month, an enormous sum at the time for these treatments. News of his choice spread quickly. The press covered his condition heavily and public fascination grew. Some sympathized with his fight to survive, while others criticized the methods he was relying on. Either way, his health continued to decline. By late 1980, Steve's cancer had spread throughout his body and he developed a massive tumor in his abdomen. Desperate, he flew to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, under the alias Samuel Shepard to avoid reporters. There, he underwent a risky surgery to remove the 5-pound tumor, even though American doctors had warned his heart could not handle it. Tragically, their warnings came true. Just 12 hours after the operation on November 7, 1980, Steve McQueen died of a heart attack. He was only 50 years old. His sudden death shocked fans everywhere. But before the world said goodbye, Steve himself had turned to something that gave him peace in the end: the final confession. In his last years, Steve McQueen faced something he had spent his whole life running from: the reality of his own limits. Fame, money, cars, and women had always filled his world, but when cancer struck, those things no longer seemed enough. For the first time, he turned to faith and reflection, searching for peace and meaning before the end. Steve's path to faith began with his love of flying. His flight instructor, Sammy Mason, was not just a skilled pilot, but also a man of deep Christian faith. Over time, Mason's quiet example and steady character influenced Steve, who respected strength above all else. Mason, along with his son Pete, helped guide Steve toward evangelical Christianity. This journey grew stronger when Steve met the famous evangelist Billy Graham. Graham visited him not long before his death, offering comfort and encouragement as Steve faced his illness. Moved by the sincerity of those around him, Steve made a commitment to Christianity. In the months before his passing, he was baptized, marking a dramatic shift from his rebellious past. Barbara Minty, Steve's third wife and his companion in those final months, later shared what she witnessed during this transformation. In her book, Steve McQueen, The Last Mile, she described how he softened and grew more open about his regrets. She called it his last mile journey, a time when he embraced faith and sought redemption. Steve's conversations with Barbara revealed a man looking back on his life with honesty. He admitted to mistakes, especially in how he treated his family. He spoke about the distance with his children and the pain he caused through his affairs and volatile behavior. For Barbara, these confessions were proof of a man who, even at the end, was still searching for connection and forgiveness. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories from Hollywood.